Welcome. We're so glad that you have joined us, and we continue today in our walk through the book of Exodus. I decided to skip over the well-known story of the call of Moses, even though it's such a rich and important and wonderful story. I've skipped it partly because it has been preached on so often, and I commend the story to you. Go read it in Exodus 3. But I also skipped it partly because we actually can't cover every part of the book of Exodus, every part of Moses' story in the sermon series. And so we're skipping that when we're moving on. But the gist of that story, the end of it, if you like, is that after God has called Moses, after much protesting and much reluctance on Moses' part, along with his more eloquent brother Aaron, Moses and Aaron set off for Egypt. And their task is, their vocation, their call, their instruction from God is to go to Pharaoh and to tell Pharaoh to let God's people go, to let them go from their slavery, to release them from their suffering. In fact, just to release them entirely, to let them leave the country if they wish to. And Moses' first meeting with Pharaoh, as expected, doesn't go well. God warned Moses that this wouldn't go well at first. And Pharaoh's response is, I suppose, predictable. He says, I don't know this God of whom you speak, this God who says that I must let these people go. I'm not going to let my whole labor force just leave on the instruction of some unknown God. And in fact, Pharaoh doesn't just say no as a retaliation for the impertinence of this kind of imperative instruction from this unknown God. Pharaoh then makes the Israelites work even harder. He becomes more cruel in his treatment of them. And so the Israelites are understandably angry with Moses for coming and having stuck his nose in and provoked Pharaoh's rage and made their lives even more miserable. But now kind of the stage is set for what really amounts to a kind of a battle. And the battle boils down to really this. The question is, who really is God? Or if you like, who really is in charge of everything, in a sense, even who is in charge of the world? Because Pharaoh, and if you know your Egyptology, all of Egypt was sure that Pharaoh was God. You just have to look at the pyramids. Those pyramids aren't built for people. They are built as tombs for people who were deities, who were thought of as gods. And so when Moses meets Pharaoh, he begins as God had instructed him around the burning bush, which we didn't read. And when God called Moses in that burning bush moment, Moses was uncertain and insecure. And so God showed Moses some signs and wonders that he would be able to perform in God's name to help Pharaoh realize that this God who Moses represents, that this God was real and this God meant business. And there are 2 or 3 signs that God enables Moses with. But one of the signs was for Moses to throw his shepherd's crook, his stick, to throw it on the ground, and as he did so, it turned into a snake. And then God told Moses then to pick the snake up by the tail, which is the most dangerous part to touch a venomous snake, because it could bite you. And so it's kind of a form of trust. And so Moses reaches down and picks up the snake by the tail, and as he does so, it turns back into a stick. And so that was one of the things God saying to Moses, I'll be with you, my power will be with you. So Moses begins his negotiations with Pharaoh, and with not wanting to be too flippant with the kind of stick and snake thing. And as Pharaoh sees that, he looks and then calls his own, and in the scriptures they're called his magicians. But before we go on, and because we'll refer to the magicians a few times today, I want us to be clear about exactly who these magicians are, because they aren't some primitive sorcerers from the ancient world. Like the wise men in the Christmas story, these are Egypt's intellectuals that the scripture is referring to. These are the descendants of those who had designed the pyramids, those who have knowledge of astronomy that allowed them to get shafts of sunlight or starlight to shine into buildings on particular days of the year. These were engineers and scientists and architects and mathematicians and linguists and artists and dramatists and teachers and priests and so on. These were the very best of the best of the best of Egypt. And so we don't know how they did it, but when Moses does the snake and stick thing, so do Pharaoh's magicians. They replicate the miracle. And so in response, Moses goes down to the Nile River, and using his stick again, he then turns the water of the Nile River into blood. And Pharaoh and his magicians watch, and in effect, it's not in the scripture, it's my words, but in effect they go, no problem. And they also turn water into blood. So in the battle so far, it's a draw. It's 2 each. Pharaoh's not going to let God's people go on the basis of this. Why should he? He's not ahead in the game, but he's certainly not on the back foot. He's not behind. So Moses says to Pharaoh, I'm going to cover the place. When he says I, meaning God's going to cover the place with frogs. And before long, the place is crawling, or more accurately, jumping with frogs. And then Pharaoh's magicians respond by producing their own plague of frogs, which is, in my mind, a little like scoring an own goal, because to add more frogs to an already plague of frogs seems unhelpful. But nevertheless, the point isn't about how many frogs there are. The point is, what is the score? And now the score is 3-all. I think it through and go, well, sticks and snakes could be a form of trickery, an illusion that clever people could do. If you can build a pyramid, you might be able to pull that off. Turning water into blood is kind of a form of chemistry. I think these people might have been able to do that, but I have no idea how they would replicate frogs. Anyway, at the burning bush, going back to the call of Moses, at the burning bush, Moses said to God, I don't know your name. And God's response was, my name is, I will be who I will be. Some translations have it as, I am who I am, but I think the best Hebrew scholarship says the better translation is, I will be who I will be. In other words, God's going to do what God's going to do. That's his nature. God's going to do what God's going to do. And so Moses is undeterred by these magicians and their ability to replicate frogs. And just as an aside, Walter Brueggemann points out that the better translation of the word for plague is not plague, but would be smiting, like a good South African word, a klap. So these are smitings. And the third smiting in our story, the first was stick was a kind of warm-up, and then it was blood, and then it was frogs. And now we are into gnats. And again, the good South African word for that is muggies. The third smiting, the third plague is muggies. And I want you just to think of that word with me for a moment, if you would. Muggies. They are such tiny little things. They're actually part of the mosquito family, I understand. They're the things that get caught in a cyclist's teeth when you're going down a hill fast. They're these tiny, irritating little things, muggies. And they cover the land. Muggies everywhere. And then the verse on which this whole story hinges, this whole story of the people being freed from Egypt hinges on this one verse, and it's our verse, if you like, for today. Pharaoh's magicians tried to do the same thing with their secret arts, but this time they failed. And isn't it funny how often that happens in life? It's the little things that catch us out. And I find it wonderfully intriguing that these magicians could do frogs, but they can't do muggies. They can do frogs, but they can't do muggies. And then, this is very important, the magicians know they are beaten. And they in effect declare the God who reveals himself as I will be who I will be, that is the one true God. In fact, they talk about the muggies as being the finger of God. When they saw the muggies, they saw the hand of God. It takes, they're clever people. They see what's going on. They know what's going on. It takes a kind of insight. But as we know only too well from our own recent elections in our country and in world politics, you don't need to look too far around the world, you'll see that pharaohs, in other words, world leaders, people in power, they have a different story. They aren't always the brightest buttons in the box. Through their lies, they will grasp at power. They will ignore the truth. Even if it stares them in the face, they will ignore the truth. And they will be happy to make a whole nation suffer to satisfy their own greed and their own fragile egos. It happened with Pharaoh in Moses' time, and it happens today. And because Pharaoh will not listen to the wise people that are around him, the smitings continue, the plagues go on. And this for me, despite all the magnificent things that happen in the story, this for me is really the most remarkable part of the story. Pharaoh will hold on for 7 more plagues. I need to put up all my fingers. For 7 more plagues. 7. What makes it remarkable for me is this, is that everyone knows the truth. Pharaoh himself might even know the truth. They know that Pharaoh is an emperor with no clothes. They know that he's a lame duck. It's no longer a question as to who the real God is. It's no longer, therefore, a question as to whether God's purposes will be accomplished. Because if this is the true God, if the magicians have seen the finger of God, they know what's coming, and no one doubts anymore whether Israel will one day be free. The only question is when that will happen, because they have seen the finger of God. They have seen the machis. And it takes another 6 plagues of great pain, boils and flies and hail and other sufferings that come upon the land. And then the one final devastating smiting that eventually does persuade Pharaoh to take some action. And that plague is all the firstborn sons of every family in Egypt will die. Even the firstborn of all the livestock will die. And if we read the story as we should, with a sense of metaphor, then we recognize in our own world that death is the inevitable consequence of oppression and injustice. And it's not only for those who are oppressed, it's the inevitable consequence for the oppressor as well. And in this story, it arrives suddenly, in one moment, upon Egypt. Sometimes in world politics, it creeps up on us, but in this story, it arrives suddenly. And to protect the Israelites, God instructs the people to sacrifice an unblemished lamb or goat and to smear some of the blood of the lamb on their doorposts, so that when this death arrives, it will pass over the houses where there is the blood of the lamb. At the same time, God also gave them instructions to eat a special meal together, a meal they had to eat that night when death was going to come. They had to eat bride, not boiled lamb. They had to have bitter herbs with it and some unleavened bread. And so, as promised, death indeed comes, and all of Egypt weeps. And now Pharaoh doesn't just let the Israelites go, he now expels them from Egypt. He goes, get out of here, I don't want you around. And we know the story changes a bit, but in this moment, Pharaoh doesn't want them around. At this point in our journey through Exodus, we want to pause and we want to ask, I wonder why this long story happened that way. Why does the story have 10 plagues and not 3? Why did God not give Pharaoh just say 3 chances? Let's do frogs, machis, and death, and by then Pharaoh would be persuaded. Because that's kind of how stories usually go, you know. We tell stories, there's a minister and a priest and a rabbi, and they walk into the bar. To tell the story, just 3 would have been fine. Why 10? I think there are 2 main reasons why that is so. One of the answers might surprise you. Let me start with the less surprising of the 2. I think on the one hand, the 10 is there because the story is intended to demonstrate the reality and the power of God through these various smitings, through these various plagues. After the frogs, starting with the machis, we see what God alone can do. We keep hearing time after time through each of the plagues of how God's power exceeds the best of human ingenuity. The magicians are never heard from again. We see that God is indeed in charge and Pharaoh is not. We see that God will have ultimate victory over all principalities and powers. And the repetitiveness of this thing reminds us of God's greatness over and over again. And in that sense, 10 times is helpful. But the other reason, the one which might be surprising, is that this is a story, if you read carefully, you will see that this story, the story about the plagues, is really a story intended to be told to children. Not just for adults, it's intended for children. I think they made children tougher 3,000 years ago. But just think, although it does get a bit PG rated in parts, the writer of the story never tries to explain why some of these terrible things happen. All they do is tell the story. And it's a story. It's got frogs and machis and locusts and flies and sticks and snakes and storms and all other kinds of things that happen. And the reason it's written for children as a children's story is because it's intended to be a story that will be passed on from generation to generation. It's been prepared in a way so that people will want to tell the story and want to tell it to their children and to their children's children. It's a story by which we can raise our children. It's filled with truth by which we can raise our children. It's a story to be passed on, as I said. Maybe not always the literalness of the story, but the truth of the story belongs in the hearts of our children as much as it belongs in our own. In fact, some of you I'm sure will know this, but in today's world, in the 21st century, when Jewish people gather for the Passover meal over Passover, 4 children are given the task of asking questions. And the central question in the midst of the Passover meal is, what does this story, the one we've just been speaking about today, what does this story mean? And so the story is filled with repetition, the kind of repetition which is intended to get into your head and mine, and intended to get into the mind and the head of it and the heart of a child. To close with today, and I know we've been here for a while already, but to close with today, can I just leave you with 4 things, 4 repetitions that maybe you can include in your own life. Firstly, repeated often in the story are God's instruction to let my people go. Let my people go. And that simple phrase can become your prayer and my prayer, that no one in our world should live in bondage. No one. And there are different kinds of bondage that happen in our world, whether it's poverty or violence, whether it's spiritual bondage. They're just, people live in lots of, and we should make it our prayer and our lifestyle that no one should live in bondage. Let my people go. Let that phrase live in you. The second thing that keeps getting repeated in the story is Pharaoh keeps lying. It's interesting. In fact, I read the whole story again, obviously, this last week, and I was very frustrated with both Pharaoh and with Moses for putting up with these constant lies. And I think that's the point of the story. We're meant to feel our own frustrations with injustice. We're meant to feel our frustration with the deceit and the lies that happen in our world. We are meant, if you like, to burn with anger against injustice, as we spoke of last week. Because I think when we cease to burn against injustice, when we acquiesce to our own complacencies, then we have ceased to be the people of the God of the Exodus. We might be the people of some other kind of God, but we're certainly not the people of the God of the Exodus. We are called to feel our frustrations, feel Moses' frustration with Pharaoh, and feel that in our world today, and let that live in our hearts. The third thing that comes up for us in the repetitiveness of the story is that as God keeps giving evil Pharaoh a chance to change his mind, we get a sense of the mercy of God. As much as Pharaoh keeps lying, we just have plague after plague after plague. And as I mentioned earlier, why don't you just bring this thing to an end quickly? Bring the death one sooner. But God shows mercy after mercy, giving Pharaoh opportunity after opportunity, because it's God's desire that all people should be saved and that none should perish. And I think it's a good reminder for us that God is merciful, and we too, as we listen to the repetitiveness of the story, that we too make living mercifully a part of our lives. I was thinking this past week, I had an opportunity to show someone mercy, and I never did as much as I could have. And I regret that deeply. It's a good warning. It's a good thing to have in our hearts. Live mercifully. Let me end with this. The fourth thing that we keep being reminded of in the story is that we ultimately end up with the assurance that eventually, by the blood of the Lamb, God will gain victory over this evil represented through Pharaoh, and that God will set his people free. And that this freedom, I want to point out today, this is very important, it comes up a lot in the story. This freedom is not freedom for freedom's sake. And it's not even spoken of as freedom from slavery when freedom is spoken of in this passage. When Moses says to Pharaoh, let my people go, he doesn't say let my people go to free them from their suffering. He says, let my people go so that they could go and worship me. Let my people go so that they can go and become a people of obedience to me. And so this is a story that calls us into a life of worship of the one true God. And I want to say to us today, worship is God's highest call on all of those whom he sets free. If you sense that God has set you free in your life, his highest call upon your life is that you would live a life of worship. Pharaoh's magicians tried to do the same thing with their secret arts, but this time they failed. We cannot do these things on our own. Maybe with me you would pray, God help us. God bless you. Amen.